Thank you guys for being here. So as Deborah mentioned, my name is Tahira, and I'm going to let each of our panelists here introduce themselves. It'll be easier that way.
All right. My name is Beuerlein. I'm the EVP of Business Development for Hypur. We're a technology provider for banks and credit unions. I was one of the original employees with the company, and as a result, been fortunate to touch every aspect of our company. So I sit with our bank and credit union clients across the country, with their operators. I know a lot of you from the industry, and also spend a lot of time with the regulatory bodies.
Hi, I'm Matt Karnes. I'm the founder of GreenWave Advisors. I founded GreenWave about 4.5 years ago. I'm based here in New York City. What we do is we provide financial research and analysis for the cannabis industry. I'm a former sell-side and buy-side equity analyst, as well as an auditor. I used to work with one of the big four. Also served at a bank, worked at Chase, wrote their policies on accounting for derivatives, which is probably one of the most boring topics you could imagine. But that said, it just gave me a lot of insights as to how auditors think, which is one of the impetuses for why I decided to write a report on banking in cannabis.
My name is Herrera. I'm EVP of Banking and Compliance with Hypur. I have over 26 years experience in financial services, 18 years as Chief Information Officer of a bank. And over the last 4.5 years, I've worked with Hypur, and I deal with banking and compliance issues with our clients. And so we partner with banks and credit unions. Our technologies enable these financial institutions to bank cash-intensive businesses and higher risk types of businesses, such as marijuana-related businesses.
So to start off, there was recently a report that said that FinCEN released that there are 441 banks and credit unions that are serving marijuana-related businesses, and that's up from 340 institutions reported last year. Andre, to start off, I guess, kind of level set, can you help define marijuana-related businesses and what the different categories are?
Well, certainly. So when you look at the FinCEN documentation from February of 2014, it defines a marijuana-related business as, it uses the phrase derived income. And so if you're looking at it from FinCEN standpoint, if you derive any revenue from cannabis, they consider you a marijuana-related business. Now, more from a practical standpoint, at the financial institution level, there's more of a three-tiered system, in categorizing marijuana-related businesses. You have a tier 1 type of business, and a tier 1 marijuana-related business would be someone that's product touching. And so like your cultivators, your dispensaries, your infused product manufacturers, testing companies, those would be tier 1 companies. A tier 2 MRB would be a company that is deriving the bulk of their revenue. They directly support those tier 1 merchants. And then on the tier 3 level, those are the businesses that have, I'm going to say, inconsequential contact with the business. So if you're a CPA and you do the taxes for an MRB and it's a very minority share of your business, then you'd be considered a tier 3 MRB. Obviously, from a banking standpoint, the tier 1s have the most difficulty in obtaining banking accounts. Tier 2, a little bit easier, but still difficult. And typically, your tier 3 types of MRBs, they already have accounts and they're already within the system.
So Matt, you released a report last year about cannabis banking in general. Do you find that the numbers that FinCEN's reporting is accurate as far as how many institutions are actually servicing the cannabis industry and marijuana-related businesses?
It's really hard to get a read on that. Just to your point, when these disclosures are made by the banks, they're not oftentimes actively banking cannabis businesses. So what I try to do when I wrote this report was really try and get a handle on what's going on in the banking environment, really for investors to put them at ease, not so much as an investment opportunity, but to really kind of lay things out. And when I analyzed the FinCEN data, it looks like because the banks are hovering over about 400, that's what they're reporting, and they disclose what the terminations are. So you can imply what the number of banks that have been added. So as quickly as a bank account is shut down, another one is opened. So it could just be the same businesses just repeating.
Got it. So there are often misconceptions in the industry about being able to take credit cards and debit cards and how much cash is involved in the business. Tyler, can you talk a little bit about the debit and credit card networks and the use of cash in marijuana-related businesses?
Sure. So I think it's important for everybody to understand that the debit and credit networks are opposed. And I hear a lot of people say, well, we understand we can't use credit cards, but debit is essentially an ACH, and what they're missing is the debit network is still a network. And they're opposed, I think, out of necessity at this point, because it still is a federally illegal product. But to take it a step further, it's also important for operators to realize that if you're using these forms of payment, you're most likely going to put your relationship with your bank or credit union in jeopardy. And the reason being is because most banks and credit unions don't want to know that you've misrepresented your application to an acquiring bank somewhere, and their regulators are also looking at it. So we have many clients who will sit down with their operator and say, look, we're willing to bank you, but if we find out you're doing certain things that are not permissible, running debit or credit products, we're just going to shut down your bank account, no questions asked. So we've built a product called Hypur Commerce that's rolled out in multiple markets and allows for permissible digital commerce in all of these different markets. Very user-friendly. Our banks originate those transactions on behalf of their own merchants.
And how many types of businesses do you guys have on the Hypur network?
We touch every aspect of the industries that our banks bank. So our banks bank and credit unions bank cultivators, retailers, marijuana-infused product companies. So Hypur Commerce is the consumer-to-business platform, and then we have Hypur Payments, which allows business-to-business commerce permissibly in that ecosystem.
Got it. Andre, with the recession of the Cole memo in January, what impact have you seen on the financial institutions, I guess, kind of thinking from that time frame to now?
All right, well, that's a good question. So when you look at the federal guidance regarding the banking of marijuana, you had two documents. You had the Cole Memorandum, and then you had the FinCEN guidance. And so when the Cole Memorandum was rescinded, I think there was a lot of what I call like a knee-jerk reaction. And so some of the institutions that were considering getting in the space, that might have been just on the edge one way or the other, they put pause, they hit the brakes a little bit. There's only one institution that we're aware of that when the Cole Memorandum was rescinded, that they actually stopped taking any accounts and they closed those existing accounts. But after a little bit of time has passed, I've actually seen a reversal. So I think in a certain way, having the Cole Memorandum rescinded has created a positive effect for banks. And so as every day goes by and institutions are looking back and they're saying, oh, hold on, the Cole Memorandum was rescinded and the world didn't explode. And the attorneys and the DOJ didn't go after all of these bankers. And so the bankers are seeing it actually safer now that that Cole Memorandum was rescinded. So it's overall been a positive effect outside of that initial, like a knee-jerk reaction. But institutions are actually more comfortable now that things are going just as they would before in banking marijuana.
And have you seen any action taken against financial institutions who do bank marijuana-related businesses?
So we watch that fairly closely, and to this date, there has not been a banker that has gone to jail, strictly for banking cannabis. We have not seen any enforcement actions, any civil money penalties, against these bankers. And so, I think that as long as these bankers are following the proper guidelines, if they're following sound banking practices, and they're doing it in a safe manner, then they're able to bank the space.
Kind of turning a little bit back to Hypur, since you guys are on the front lines and you're interacting with the banks, working with all these businesses, why do you think more financial institutions are not getting into the business now that the market has really expanded, and kind of given that the Cole Memorandum hasn't broken down the market and everybody's not running away from it?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, so I think they all have different reasons for maybe not getting into the space, but this is a highly regulated, cash-intensive industry, and those industries, even outside of cannabis, have had banking issues for years because they're extremely burdensome for the institutions trying to bank them. Candidly, that's why we're here. But not only is the financial institution's charter on the line, but also the officers of a financial institution have personal liability when banking these industries. So if I'm a chief compliance officer, something goes wrong in my institution, I can have a civil money penalty imposed on me personally that can't be covered by the insurance policy of that institution. So, again, I think that people fail to realize that not only is that charter on the line, because technically they're banking a federally illegal industry, but also there's personal liability within that institution. So those are the typical reasons why we see institutions shy away from it. And then candidly, many of them are misinformed. So they don't know that they can do it. They don't know how to do it. So when we meet with new banks and credit unions, which is nearly on a weekly basis at this point, they want to know. And the questions, are, look, we want to bank this. Can we bank it? And if so, how? And so a lot of what we do is on the educational front, aside from the technology side.
When it comes to using the Hypur product, what is pricing like for that? Is that on the bank side? Is that on the business side? Who's using the product?
Our clients are solely banks and credit unions. There are feature sets that touch their merchants and consumer, but only through that bank or credit union.
Matt, when we think about federal legalization and the impact that that's going to have on the U.S. in particular, how do you think that that's going to impact the banking environment?
When prohibition ends, I think it'll be like any other business, and there won't be the issue of whether or not you're able to bank or any fear of banking a cannabis business.
Do you think that the level of transparency and all of the information that is tracked now, like the business like Hypur is doing, I mean, how do you think that type of information translate? Will there still be a need for that type of information?
Probably on a lower scale. I think right now it's very important to have the internal controls in place and to really be able to track and understand and know your customer. I think that was the biggest fear, if I'm not mistaken, for some of these banks, in that they had to be 100% sure that their customer was in compliance with the co-memo, and they just don't have the resources to kind of figure all that out. So that's why I think the Hypur of the world, provides a good alternative. And
I guess for all three of you, how do you guys view this product? It seems like it's something that could apply to many industries, not just cannabis. There are a lot of industries where you would want to know your customer's customer, but really hasn't been enforced because we haven't been in this situation where we're working with a federally illegal product. So what do you think about that?
Well, I could tell you, and I mean, this goes back a long time ago, so I'm sure systems are a lot more sophisticated now, but even back in the 90s, there were procedures and controls in place to really ensure that you knew your customer when they were onboarded. There was a lot of checks and balances. But I think now you actually have to take it to a different level, because where's this money coming from? More so than just any other type of business.
Well, in my banking days, I banked a lot of cash-intensive businesses. I banked a lot of higher-risk industries. And I did not have the technology that exists today. And a lot of the products and feature set that we have within Hypur came from my own experience, my own difficulties in my own institution. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be cannabis. It can be any type of cash-intensive business or any business that the regulators or the banking regulators consider a higher-risk business. Even if cannabis was made legal today, all the banks and credit unions still have to deal with the anti-money laundering aspects, the know your customer. So there's still all of these banking regulations that have to be followed, whether the product is legal or illegal. But with Hypur, we said, all right, if we can make it easier for these banks and credit unions to manage the process, to deal with applications, documentation, transaction monitoring. I mean, we're monitoring almost $600 million a month in debits and credits across our platform. And so we put it to where a bank or credit union can simply deal with the exceptions rather than having to go through and spend all of these hours and waste the time looking at each transaction. And so we try to make life easier for the bankers. If it's easier for the bankers, it's easier for their regulators as well. I spend a lot of time with the NCUA, with the FRB, the OCC, and the FDIC. And when you talk to them about banking marijuana, they're pretty much consistent across the board. It's a permissible activity, but we want to make sure it's done right. And so they want to make sure that any bank or credit union entering the space is doing it in a proper manner. And they like transparency, they like ease of audit. And so those are things that our platform brings to the community.
Yeah, I think to Andre's point, it's important to realize that there are industries far larger than the size of the cannabis industry currently that have had banking issues far before cannabis. And those include check cashers, payday lenders, cross-border remittance, the pawn industries. All of those industries have had significant challenges, and that's really what we're originally built for. Also, to tell a quick story in regards to, I think it's important to set a standard in this industry of how this industry can and should be banked. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to enable the industry to thrive. I got a phone call from a CEO of an institution a few weeks ago. And he made a comment to me, and he said, look, I don't know if I've ever seen a technology provider have an effect on an industry quite like this. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, been banking the industry for almost 3 years. I had a visit from my regulators, and when they left, they gave me a laundry list of data points I needed to provide going forward. And my question to them was twofold. One, I've been banking this for 3 years. What's changed? And two, how on earth am I going to provide this information? And the regulator said to him, look, we have institutions using a product called Hypur. That's the new standard. And for us, that spoke volumes. It's legitimized everything we've done for the last 4.5 years. And it's also, more importantly, we feel like we're helping shape a standard in this industry. And that's really, really important for everybody.
So with that, how easy is it now for that institution to be able to report that information?
Extremely. So we're in the process of, doing some things with them, and they'll be able to check those boxes.
And be able to just very frequently be able to send out that information.
Not even send it. It's real time. So we always put our institutions in a proactive, not reactive approach.
Andre, there's been a lot of conversation in various states that are looking at state-owned and run marijuana banks. There've been a variety of feasibility studies. What do you think is the feasibility of those types of institutions?
Well, a lot of people that are talking about state banks have never worked at a bank before. And so they're probably not real familiar with all of the types of regulations and things that you need to go through in opening up a bank. And so when I hear about states that are looking at opening up a state-run, state-owned institution, a number of states have already gone through the feasibility studies, and those have not been successful. I know California is looking at that at this moment. But to open up a new bank, you have to have a Federal Reserve master account. And it's that master account that connects all of the financial institutions together. And so without that account, you can't cash a check, you can't send a wire, you can't get an ACH. And so all of the things that we're used to in day-to-day banking, those are not available to you. And the Federal Reserve has yet to issue a master account for a financial institution that is focused on the marijuana industry. And so I look at the Fourth Corner Credit Union in Colorado. Of course, you can go through their history, and they went through literally years of the process, applications, suing the government. And at the end of the day, they didn't get exactly what they wanted. And so I'm going to say it wasn't exactly what the credit union's goal was. And so with a state-run institution, it's not going to be any different. It's still going to have to comply with federal regulations. It's still going to have to comply with all of your BSA, AML, regulations. And so just simply the ownership of that institution is not going to be a magical fix for that. Is it theoretically possible? The answer is yes, it's theoretically possible, but we place a very low probability on that occurring. And the same thing for new institutions. For about 2.5 years, every week I'd get a call from someone and say, hey, Andre, I've got $30 million. I want to open up a bank or credit union for marijuana. And so I'll go through. I had about a 20-minute reply to that. I say, all right, you got a big building, you've got nice teller stations, you put a vault in there. Now what are you going to do? He's going to put the money in the vault and just stare at it. And so that master account is very important, in that. There are cash solutions that exist in the marketplace, and so there are vaulting companies, such as like Beuerlein, that does certain cash services. But from a de novo bank or a new institution, that's extremely difficult for someone to get open, by the Federal Reserve.
And I don't think it's practical either. I mean, by the time these banks, if a new bank were to be opened, by the time the cost is incurred and everything's up and running, prohibition will probably be over. So what's the point? It doesn't seem practical.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess for all of you guys, as you're looking at different financial institutions, and the lens from Hypur is a little bit different, but Matt, you've studied so many financial institutions. How difficult is it for them to get involved in banking a marijuana-related business? What process do they have to go through?
For a business to get to...
No, for a bank to start banking those businesses.
Well,
what do they need to do?
I think it's a matter of just the management policy, their appetite to, accept the risk associated with a marijuana-related business. But to put things in perspective, there are about 11,000 credit unions and financial institutions in the United States. There are about 7,000 in those states where marijuana is legal. So that represents, about 400 banks, and each banks about 50 businesses, you're talking about 7% of the total population of the banks are banking. So there's a huge, huge gap. And a great opportunity for Hypur to onboard all those institutions.
We actually believe the number is less than 30 institutions in total in the U.S. openly banking the space. When I say that, I mean 10 to 15 accounts or more. They have a full board buy-in. They have a dedicated marijuana-related business program, and they're actively pursuing growth. And that's based on a frontline view for over 4 years in every state.
If a marijuana-related business doesn't have a banking relationship and doesn't necessarily know who other businesses use to bank, how do they engage in those relationships? What are the resources and the steps that they would need to take to find one?
I get calls daily and have for years, and we always try and pair a operator in the space with the appropriate institution in that state, and we're happy to do that as a service to the industry. I think it's important that if you're operating in this space prior to a transparent banking relationship, keep crystal clear books. Get a third-party forensic audit for the monies coming into your operation, because if you don't, you're never going to get that cash into an institution. They're going to consider it legacy cash. If they can't prove the provenance of those funds prior to their relationship, it's not going in that institution. And if they do accept it, it's probably an institution that isn't going to be banking the industry long. So just be aware of those things and try and be as above board as possible.
Matt, when we think about the investment landscape, and of course investment in cannabis is increasing, how does the banking element, particularly in the U.S., affect the investment market?
Well, I think there's a lot of fear. There's certainly added risk. So when you do your valuation, there's a risk factor that presumably would be higher because most of these businesses are operating in a cash business. But I personally think soon, over the next maybe 2 to 3 years, this issue will be resolved. Either prohibition will end or the States Act will be passed, which will presumably allow banks to operate as any other type of, to bank any other a marijuana business like any other business.
And what impact has all of this had on tax revenue? The fact that it's a highly cash business. It's difficult for some businesses to even pay their taxes. So what do you think the loss factor is for what's being collected?
Well, because it's in a cash business, I mean, if you're a law-abiding, business, I mean, you should be collecting the taxes and depositing the taxes. There's definitely the risk of you're talking about some of that money not ending up in a bank account. Mm-hmm. I think to your point about making sure there's an audit, making sure that there's a trail for everything would be probably one of the most important things. But it's clearly a public safety issue because not only do you have the tax revenues, the sales revenues from these dispensaries and these cash businesses, but you also have the tax added onto that, mm-hmm. So it increases the amount. One thing I think what the state of California was looking at is to have there was a Fed window. I think there's a Fed window in California where you can take your tax receipts and deposit it right into a Fed account. I don't know where that stands.
Talking about the BOE offices?
Yeah.
Well, it is a safety issue, and not just for the operators, but it's a safety issue for the state. And so the states, they have their places where you take make your tax payments, and people are literally walking in with backpacks full of cash to pay their taxes. And so that's extremely dangerous because these tax locations, they weren't designed for handling a lot of cash. They don't have all the security aspects. It's not like you walk in and you have the bulletproof glass and all of the security guards everywhere. And so it's not safe. And having secure and safe electronic payments to pay taxes, it's good for all of the state workers. It's good for the tax collection. And also, you mentioned California. In California, they've had marijuana banking there for many years, but it's been disguised, it's been masked. And so not all of the operators are following all of the new laws and regulations in there, and so there probably is a lot of lost tax revenue in these states until all the licensing gets in place.
And what impact has all of this had on tax revenue? The fact that it's a highly cash business. It's difficult for some businesses to even pay their taxes. So what do you think the loss factor is for what's being collected?
You'd hope that they're compensating controls with the seed-to-sale tracking, and it'd be interesting to see how things shake out, because my guess is there's going to be a lot of audits that are going to reveal at some point that a lot of the money's not getting to where it should be.
And is there any way that companies now are regularly auditing their businesses? I mean, are there tools that they can use? Are there, just policies, kind of SOPs in place?
I mean, as a former auditor, I would say it's very nascent. I don't think anybody really knows what's going on, to be honest with you. I think it's going to take some time.
That's reassuring.
Some states actually require it. And so we've seen that in medical markets where a state will require that they have a yearly audit by a verified third party.
So there are businesses that are doing these audits within
Correct.
the industry
Yep.
and on a regular basis. So before I'll open it up for questions, but before we do that, I wanted to kind of open it up to you guys on based on your experience in the market, what you're seeing, what do you think is going to happen when it comes to banking? I think in the short term, as we're still under this federal illegal environment, or I guess on the other side of that, what do you hope will happen as the market continues to progress until we get to that federal legalization point?
So I see attitudes changing. And so about 3 years ago, I was at a bank association conference, and I'd mention the word marijuana, and it'd be owls and crickets. I mean, so you couldn't get anyone to even talk about it. About a year later, they asked me to speak at their annual event. And so bankers that had the thought, I'll never ever do this, are now saying, all right, maybe I'm in it. Now maybe I'm going for it. Their banks go into this for different reasons. Some are in it for community service. They think, hey, I'm doing the community service, public service by bringing in these monies, taking this money off the street and opening accounts. Others are saying, I'm doing it for the money. Others have some personal contact with marijuana. They have a family member that is using medical marijuana. And so there are different reasons that these institutions are getting into the space, but more and more are open to it now than even 1 year ago. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, I think something that would be very helpful is to have more guidance. So I hate to say more regulation, but in this case, more regulation is a good thing. When you go out and you look at every other banking product, there's a government entity, it's called the FFIEC, and the FFIEC publishes, handbooks, examination handbooks, recommendations, best practices for pretty much every financial product out there. If you go out to the FFIEC's website and you look for the marijuana examination handbook, it doesn't exist. And so when a banker is looking at this, he goes, wow, I've got a rescinded cold memorandum, and I've got this FinCEN guidance, which is about 7 pages long. That's not a lot to go by. And so having more regulations, having more guidance, even when legal, I think it's going to help the space. And so by having more specific policies and procedures from a federal standpoint will enable and it'll make more banks feel, and credit unions feel more comfortable in getting into space.
I would say I would hope that the banks have more comfort now in opening these accounts as time has gone on, because it's very clear, at least in my mind, that the Trump administration is not shutting down this business. If they were going to shut it down, they would have done so already. We're 2 years in. I think the risk to a bank is very minimal, unless you're with El Chapo or something and you're hoarding in all this cash from some kind of trade. But I think, and also not only just the plant touching businesses, but a lot of people have been shut down, shunned out for ancillary businesses. Have nothing to do at all. I'm lucky. I was able to open up an account pretty easily. And I have marijuana, the name marijuana all over my, I hope there are no bankers here. But it's, really should be something that should be a lot easier for most other businesses as well.
But you have seen that it's an impact on people's personal accounts too, right?
Yeah.
It's not just the business accounts that we're seeing. I've heard plenty of stories of people have their own personal, checking and bank and savings accounts shut down because they're affiliated with the industry. Are you still seeing that in the space?
Well, actually, that goes back to that FinCEN, guidance. And so the FinCEN guidance from 2014 actually talks about a suspicious activity report that financial institutions have to file if they have a depository account that is deriving revenue from a marijuana-related business. So if you take that guidance literally, if you take it to the letter, then theoretically employees of MRBs, the owner's personal accounts, all of those would be subject to those SAR reporting requirements. And rather than have an institution saying, well, should I be, do I have to file these SARs on these people? It's just easier if they say no. And they say, no, we're just not going to bank it. And they think it's easier that way by not having to deal with the problem. But again, that comes back to additional guidance, further guidance, better definition on what exactly is a marijuana-related business.
I think going forward, too, again, going back to money services businesses, those industries are perfectly legal, but there are a very small number of institutions willing to bank them because of the regulatory compliance burden. And I think the cannabis industry is going to be very similar. So the notion that, if this goes federally legal tomorrow, all of a sudden every bank or credit union is going to jump into the space, we don't believe that to be accurate, just based on what we see on the front lines. But again, things are changing. So with every new state that comes online, there's a new set of banks or credit unions that are going to bank that state's market. So that's opening up new banking. As regulatory bodies, like I said, get more accustomed to auditing financial institutions that are banking this space, that helps everybody because they're starting to look for things that maybe they weren't aware of in the past, and they're getting more comfortable with these banks and credit unions being in the space. And then look, the payment side of the fence is opening up. We're very fortunate. We've done a lot of work in this space, obviously, but we are about to be able to offer both our business-to-business and consumer-to-business products nationwide. And that will help many people in this industry transact in a permissible, above-board, transparent manner. And again, all of these things contribute to legitimacy and enabling this entire ecosystem to thrive.
Thank you, guys. I'd love to open it up to any questions from the audience right now. Oh, we got one. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, nobody's talking about lending. Are banks ever going to do any lending in this space? Because the space, it's been getting a lot of money, capital from family offices, venture capital, some private equity firms, but no bank loans, no debt. In terms of bank debt. So, any possibility of that happening?
The actual answer is yes. There are institutions, there are banks and credit unions that are lending directly into the space. You have a couple of problems in there. Now, it's not a lot, so it's not like there are 20 of those. It's more like there are 3 or 4 of those that are lending to the space. You have a couple issues. The first one that always comes into my head is perfection of collateral. All right, so if you're a financial institution, you're making a loan, if you cannot perfect that collateral, then what do you really have? And so if I'm a banker and I've got a cultivator that I've loaned on and they go out of business, am I going to go and grab all their marijuana? Now, what am I going to do with it? I'm not licensed. I can't do anything with it. I'm just going to stare at it. And then another consideration, pass it out to the tellers. And another issue, kind of more behind the scenes, is going to be on loan loss reserves. And so if I cannot perfect my collateral, am I going to have like a 1-to-1 loan loss reserve, for those loans? And so it's a lot of unknowns, but to answer your question, yes, there are institutions that are lending in the space. Typically, they're doing real estate type loans at very low loan-to-value ratios.
What about money made on transactions on how complex does that get, right? Because you're doing over-the-counter stuff and then cash out after a year and the laws are still in transition. What happens?
So basically, you're talking about all of the individuals. So actually, I wrote an article about a month and a half ago, sent out to financial institutions saying, you're already banking marijuana, you just don't know it. All right, and so I live in Monterey County in California, and it's surprising how many people are touching the space. Just friends and acquaintances that I never would have thought would be in the marijuana business. Oh yeah, I'm invested over here. Oh, I got money over here. And then you've got these mutual funds. You have all of the tax money. So think about it. Every government that's collecting taxes, every county, every local municipality, that's all marijuana money. And it's all going to these banks. So it's even going into your large, I'll call them big box institutions. And so whether they know it or not, pretty much every institution has marijuana money touching it in some manner. And the regulators understand this. And so the regulators understand that this is something that is probably here to stay. And so every regulator that I've spoken to, like in the last year, there have been very positive discussions that say, hey, we know we've got to have the right and proper way to manage and audit these at the financial institution level.
To the back first.
Yeah. Besides money laundering, what specific liabilities are the banks trying to avoid in terms of compliance? And secondly, how does Hypur
All right, so let me just kind of take those one by one. I have Tyler answer a couple of those. All right, so all of your existing banking regulations, all of your customer information program, all of your customer due diligence, your enhanced due diligence, all of your OFAC, your 314A. I mean, I can list regulations all day, but all of those still pertain, and so they're not any different. All right, regulators are viewing this as another financial services product. They're not saying, all right, here are your money service businesses, here are your car loans, but your marijuana is something completely different. No, actually, they're considering that another financial product, a higher risk financial product, but yet another financial product. Right? And so all of your existing banking regulations apply. And how Hypur helps is we take all the heavy lifting off of those financial institutions. We have things like document management, digital applications. We assist them with CTRs and SARs. I mean, we have quite a long list of features that basically touch the entire life cycle, of banking a marijuana-related business, from when they're a prospect through the onboarding process, the application process, the ongoing due diligence, which is very important also, to site visit management and transaction monitoring.
So think of us as a combination of a RegTech and a FinTech in one cohesive platform. Our client is the bank or credit union, but one of the things we do that's very unique is financial institutions in the past have been reactive. What I mean by that is if I'm accepting cash deposits, I'm reconciling every 30 days or whatever that velocity is. Well, if money's been laundered through my institution during that time period, it's too late. So we integrate with most of the major point of sale providers in this space. So if I'm a bank officer, I can pull up any account in real time. I can click on a button and see every transaction happening in real time. And at the end of the day, I receive an expected cash deposit amount, which lets me know exactly what should be coming in my door before it ever gets there. So that's one of the things that help eliminate blind spots and put the institution in a proactive, not reactive approach.
And in regard to the marijuana-related business, what do they have to do to assist either you or the bank comply with what you like?
So our product touches consumers, it touches the MRBs, and touches the financial institutions, touches the applicants, and each one of those entities, they have their own dashboard. And we have a very holistic approach to this. And so even though you have these different dashboards, they're all integrated and they talk to each other. So for an example, if I'm a financial institution and I need a quarterly financial, all right, well, Hypur automatically notifies the MRB, oh, you've got this document that's due, and then that MRB logs into their dashboard within Hypur. They submit that documentation. It automatically goes to the financial institution. It notifies the account manager. And so it facilitates and makes that whole process not only easier, but from a regulatory standpoint, it adds a lot of transparency. So anytime someone does anything, anytime someone approves a document or declines a document, we know exactly who did it at the institution, at what date and what time.
And I think part of your question is, look, every institution is a little different from a policy and procedure standpoint, so they're going to ask for different things. So think of Hypur's technology wrapping around those policies and procedures and automating those processes. So everybody's a little different. Yes. So we have a client, we have a couple clients actually that will openly bank the hemp-based CBD market. And their regulatory body feels like they don't even need to do additional review in some cases. They're very comfortable with it. And we've actually published an e-commerce API, and we've launched a WooCommerce and Magento plugin to enable e-commerce in a permissible manner for CBD operators across the country. So we can help them get a transparent banking relationship, and they will also have access to Hypur Commerce through that relationship. They look for verification that it's hemp-based and under, I believe it's 0.3 THC level. Yeah.
Do you see yourself sitting on any ISO bodies at any point to standardize this to like an international format, on the technical side, like, this is how we do it in the process and this and that, how you implement that across the globe?
Well, we've been focused on the United States at this point, but every regulator that we've been into, and we've been invited to every federal regulator, every regulator they like the transparency. and they like the data set. Of course, are we setting the bar high? Yes, we are. Because in absence of specific guidance, we're going to do things as right and correct as possible.
You're the first to market to do it, so most of your stuff is at some point copyrighted, or not everyone knows about how you do it. Pretty much. Cool.
Very few people have seen the technology in its entirety. Typically, it's either a federal regulator, state regulator, or a financial institution.
That's a good question. All right. So blockchain from a technology standpoint, I love it. I think it's great technology. I think it's the future of transaction processing and the way that banks process everyday transactions. When you look at the cryptocurrency side of it, so let's take away the technology and let's look at the digital currency. You're bringing in something that has a lot of anonymous sides, even though you can track the ledger. So I'm not talking about tracking a ledger, but it's who's on the other side. Where did that Bitcoin come from? And so I don't think that it's the right product for cannabis, at this time, because of the lack of full transparency on who's doing the transactions, where did all of those monies come from. So I don't think it's the best thing for cannabis.
And to Andre's point, in our discussions with regulatory bodies at the federal and state level, a lot of the questions have been geared towards what are you seeing on the transaction side of the fence. And anytime cryptocurrency is brought up, at both levels, they've said absolutely, unequivocally, we do not feel comfortable with that being involved in this space. And so, again, if you're looking from a top-down perspective, the regulators are going to drive the conversation to the financial institutions, which is going to drive that conversation down to the operators. So most of our bank and credit union clients, if they find out their operators are running those forms of payment, again, they'll just shut down their bank account. Blockchain. It's hard to, yeah.
One is the fundamental technology, and one is the currency part of it. Do you see blockchain being more involved in this, or not necessarily too far ahead?
I think you're looking a little bit too far ahead, but absolutely, like I mentioned, I like blockchain technology, and I think at some point it will replace all core systems that are typically found in financial institutions, but this is something that is definitely down the road.
And maybe in seed to sale, it might be come on board quicker than for the banking.